Take the money, all of it. Just let him go, Elisa demanded, her voice trembling but her grip on the rusted cage unyielding. The smuggler sneered, kicking the iron bars. Inside, a massive black wolf flinched, blood matting its dark fur. That's rent money, little Omega, the man mocked, eyeing the handful of tarnished silver coins and crumpled bills in her palm. You're already cast out. You buy this beast, you starve on the streets. You know they don't take back rejects. Elisa swallowed hard, the faded rejection mark on her neck burning in the freezing rain. She looked into the wolf's golden, intelligent eyes filled with an unsettling, silent fury. I said, she whispered, stepping closer, take the coins. The transaction left her pockets hollow, the cold metal of her keys the only weight remaining. Elisa draped her thin, patched coat over the wolf's shivering back. He was massive, his shoulder reaching her hip, yet he swayed like a felled oak ready to crash to the forest floor. He did not growl when she touched him. He only watched her with those striking, luminous golden eyes. Come on, she coaxed, her breath forming white plumes in the frigid night air. Just a few more blocks. I promise it's warm. It was a lie, of course. Her apartment was a drafty studio sitting above a failing laundromat, the radiator more of a decorative piece than a functional heater. But it was safe from the smuggler's steel-tipped boots and the unforgiving winter sleet. They moved at an agonizing crawl. The city around them was a blur of neon reflections and dirty puddles and the distant wail of sirens. Elisa's boots soaked through, the icy water biting at her toes, but she kept her arms securely wrapped around the thick scruff of the wolf's neck, offering herself as a crutch. She could feel the unnatural heat radiating from his injuries, the sticky warmth of fresh blood seeping through her worn cotton sweater. She didn't know why she had done it. Omegas were taught self-preservation above all else, especially after being exiled. The memory of the Alpha's cold voice, the ceremonial severing of the pack bond, and the excruciating pain that followed, still haunted her every waking hour. She was a rogue now, a status that usually meant a short, brutal life. Giving up her last $50 and a handful of silver meant no food for a week, and likely an eviction notice by Monday. Yet, when she had seen the smuggler raise that iron rod against the caged beast, a primal, undeniable instinct had surged within her. She knew what it felt like to be completely, utterly abandoned. She refused to let another creature die, feeling that same despair. Beside her, David fought to remain conscious. Every step sent jagged lightning through his ribs. The silver-laced poison the traders had used was still burning through his veins, locking him in his wolf form. He was the Alpha King, a ruler of a territory stretching across 3 state lines. Yet here he was, reduced to a limping stray dependent on a frail, banished Omega. He studied her profile as they navigated a dark alleyway. She was pale, her cheeks hollowed by malnutrition, her dark hair plastered to her face by the freezing rain. He noticed the faint, jagged scar on the side of her neck, a forcibly broken mating and pack bond. A profound injustice. Usually, an Omega cast out in such a violent manner lost their mind or perished from the sheer trauma of the severed connection. Yet, she was walking, breathing, and somehow finding the strength to carry a predator twice her weight. They reached a rusted iron staircase, clinging to the brick exterior of a crumbling building. Elisa paused, leaning against the railing, coughing violently into her sleeve. Almost there, she wheezed, forcing a fragile smile down at him. Just one flight. David marshaled the last reserves of his strength. He pushed forward, taking his weight off her, his large paws slipping on the slick metal grates. When they finally reached the landing, Elisa's hands shook so badly that she dropped her keys twice before managing to unlock the deadbolt. She pushed the heavy wooden door open, revealing a cramped, dimly lit room. The scent of lavender and old paper hit David's sensitive nose, a stark contrast to the rot and smog of the city below. It was poor, painfully so, but it was meticulously clean. He stumbled inside and immediately collapsed onto a faded rag rug near the center of the room. The hardwood floor vibrated with the impact of his fall. His vision swam, the edges of the room darkening as the silver poison surged toward his heart. Elisa didn't hesitate. She slammed the door shut, locking it quickly before dropping to her knees beside him. She stripped off her soaked sweater, shivering violently in just her thin undershirt, and began frantically pressing the dry cotton against the deepest gash on his flank. "Stay with me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please don't die. I didn't spend my rent money just to watch you die." David tried to huff, a canine attempt at reassurance, but it came out as a weak, blood-flecked cough. He felt her small, freezing hands pressing firmly against his wound, her desperation palpable. She was weeping, silent tears cutting through the grime on her cheeks. He wanted to tell her to stop wasting her tears on him. He was a king whose own inner circle had betrayed him, left for dead in a hunter's snare. He was a fool. But as her frantic heartbeat echoed in the quiet room, a strange, profound calm washed over him. The burning of the silver seemed to recede slightly, under the gentle pressure of her touch. For the first time since his betrayal, the Alpha King closed his eyes and allowed himself to be vulnerable, trusting his life to the lowest-ranking wolf in existence. The silence of the apartment was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of sleet against the single-pane window and the harsh, ragged sound of the wolf's breathing. Elisa moved with a frantic, focused energy. She fetched a rusted tin basin from her minuscule kitchen, filling it with warm water, and grabbed a worn, threadbare towel and a small pair of tweezers from her medicine cabinet. Kneeling back down on the faded rug, she took a steadying breath. "This is going to hurt," she murmured, wringing out the warm cloth. "I am so sorry." David opened one golden eye, watching her intently. He was paralyzed by the toxin, his immense body feeling like lead, but his mind remained terrifyingly sharp. He watched her hands, delicate, trembling, yet remarkably determined. As she wiped away the crusted blood on his flank, she froze. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the wound, and a sharp, involuntary hiss escaped her lips. The flesh around the injury was blackened and necrotic, refusing to heal with normal lichen speed. "Silver," Elisa whispered, horror draining the remaining color from her face. "They used silver buckshot on you." She rocked back on her heels, pressing a hand to her mouth. Normal hunters didn't use silver. It was too expensive. Silver was the weapon of assassins, of internal pack warfare. She realized then that this was no ordinary stray. A wolf this large, targeted with such expensive cruelty, meant she had just dragged something incredibly dangerous into her fragile sanctuary. David waited for her to run. He expected her to back away, to realize the danger she had put herself in, and to abandon him. It was the logical choice. Anyone hunting an alpha with silver would not hesitate to slaughter an exiled Omega who got in their way. He braced himself for the inevitable abandonment. It was, after all, what his own beta had done. Instead, Elisa leaned forward, her jaw set, a stubborn defiance replacing the fear in her eyes. "If it stays in, you die," she stated softly, her voice barely louder than the rain. "I can't afford a vet. and I can't afford painkillers. You have to be brave." She didn't know he understood every word. She picked up the tweezers, dipping them into a small bottle of rubbing alcohol before bringing them toward his side. "I'm going to dig it out," she warned. David gave a short, rigid nod of his heavy head. Elisa blinked, startled by the human-like gesture, but chalked it up to animal instinct. She took a deep breath, pinned his fur back, and pushed the tweezers into the wound. Pain, blinding and absolute, erupted through David's nervous system. A thunderous growl vibrated in his chest, rattling the floorboards. His heavy jaws snapped open, instinctively seeking the source of the agony. His teeth grazed her bare forearm. Elisa didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She maintained eye contact, her gaze locking onto his golden irises with a profound, unwavering calm. "I know," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes from the empathetic distress, her hand remaining completely steady inside the wound. "I know it burns. I'm almost there. Please, hold on." The sheer force of her will stunned him. An Omega was naturally submissive, programmed by biology to cower at the mere sound of an Alpha's pain-induced snarl. Yet here she was, commanding him with nothing but soft words and fierce empathy. Slowly, painfully, David forced his jaws to close. He laid his massive head back onto his paws, panting heavily, offering her his absolute surrender. With a sharp intake of breath, Elisa pulled back. A small, blood-soaked piece of silver buckshot clattered into the tin basin. "1," she breathed, her forehead shining with sweat. "There are 3 more. For the next hour, the tiny apartment became a surgical theater." Elisa worked with a grueling, relentless focus. Every time she extracted a piece of the toxic metal, the air in the room seemed to lighten, the oppressive aura of impending death retreating just a fraction. When the 4th and final piece hit the tin basin, she slumped forward, exhausted, resting her forehead against his uninjured shoulder. "We did it," she whispered into his thick black fur. David let out a long, shuddering sigh. The paralyzing ice in his veins began to thaw, replaced by the familiar, comforting heat of his lichen healing factor. He could feel the edges of his torn flesh beginning to knit together, the agonizing burn fading to a dull ache. He turned his head slightly, resting his nose against her cheek in a silent gesture of gratitude. Elisa smelled of rain, cheap soap, and an underlying scent that was entirely her own: vanilla and sweet cedar. It was a soothing, grounding aroma. She shifted, wrapping her arms around his thick neck, pulling his warmth against her freezing, shivering body. "You're going to be okay," she murmured, her eyelids drooping with exhaustion. "We're both going to be okay," as she drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep right there on the hard floor beside him. David remained awake, standing guard over her resting form. The Alpha King had been betrayed by the strong, but he had been saved by the weak. And as he watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, a fiercely protective vow settled deep within his chest. Whoever had hurt her, whoever had given her that jagged scar, would face his wrath. But first, he had to heal. Morning arrived, not with the gentle warmth of dawn, but with a harsh gray light that struggled to penetrate the grime-caked window of the studio apartment. Elisa woke with a sharp gasp, her muscles locked in a painful, shivering stiffness. She was curled tightly on the faded rag rug, her thin undershirt offering no protection against the bitter draft seeping under the heavy wooden door. For a disorienting second, she forgot the events of the previous night. Then, the rhythmic, heavy sound of breathing drew her gaze. The black wolf was still there, He was awake, his massive head resting on his front paws, those unsettling golden eyes tracking her every slight movement. Elisa pushed herself up onto her elbows, her joints popping in the quiet room. She looked immediately to his flank, expecting to see the terrifying, necrotic wound from the silver buckshot. Instead, she gasped. Where the gaping, blackened flesh had been, there was now only a stark, jagged expanse of pink scar tissue. The bleeding had stopped entirely. "You healed," she whispered, her voice rough with sleep and lingering cold. "I knew lichens healed fast, but this is impossible." David simply watched her. He wanted to tell her that an alpha king's healing factor was vastly superior to an average wolf's, but his vocal cords were still locked by the lingering traces of silver in his bloodstream. Shifting back to his human form now would be agonizing. And more importantly, it would terrify the fragile woman who had just saved him. He remained still, allowing her to reach out. Her small, freezing fingers hovered over his fur before gently brushing the edge of the scar. A sudden, violent shiver racked her frame, reminding David of the freezing temperature in the room. The radiator in the corner was completely silent, emitting no heat whatsoever. Before Elisa could pull away to find her sweater, a thunderous pounding echoed against the apartment door. "Open up, Elisa. I know you're in there." The harsh, gravelly voice of Mr. Haskins, the building's landlord, vibrated through the thin walls. Elisa scrambled backward, her eyes widening in pure panic. She scrambled to grab her blood-stained sweater from the floor, pulling it hastily over her head to hide the rejection scar on her neck. "Just a minute," she called out, her voice trembling. She turned to David, pressing a finger to her lips, her eyes begging for his cooperation. "Please," she mouthed. Not a sound. David remained motionless, blending into the shadows of the cramped room. The pounding resumed, rattling the loose hinges of the door. Elisa hurried over, unlatching the deadbolt, but keeping the safety chain engaged. She opened the door just a few inches. "Mr. Haskins," she said, attempting a polite, strained smile. "Good morning." "Save it," the burly man sneered, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cheap tobacco. He pushed his heavy boot against the crack of the door, testing the chain. "It's the 1st of the month. You're short on the rent again. I told you last week, I'm not running a charity for cast-outs. Where's the money? Where?" Elisa swallowed hard, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the door. I had an emergency last night, Mr. Haskins. A medical expense. I just need a few more days. By Tuesday, I swear I will have it." "Tuesday?" Haskins let out a bark of humorless laughter. "You think I was born yesterday? You don't have a job, you don't have a pack to back you up, and you look like you haven't eaten in a week. You're a liability." "Please," Elisa begged, the polite facade dropping as sheer desperation took over. "It's freezing outside. Just give me the weekend to find some day labor. I'll clean the laundromat downstairs for free. I'll fix the broken machines. Just don't lock me out." From his spot on the rug, David felt a low, dangerous rumble building in his chest. His alpha instincts, the inherent drive to protect and provide, flared violently. He watched the landlord's boot pressing against the door, threatening the woman who had given her last $50 to save his life. The urge to lunge, to tear the door from its hinges and throw the man down the iron staircase was nearly overwhelming. He shifted his weight, his claws clicking faintly against the hardwood floor. Haskins paused, his eyes narrowing as he tried to peer through the narrow gap. "What was that?" Haskins demanded. "Do you have a dog in there? You know the rules, no pets." "It's just the wind." Elisa said quickly, slamming her weight against the door to break his line of sight. The window is loose. Please, Mr. Haskins. Tuesday. The landlord glared at her, pulling his boot back. Monday morning. If you don't have the cash by 8 a.m., your things go in the alley, and I change the locks. Don't make me call animal control on whatever you're hiding in there. He turned and stomped heavily down the metal stairs. Elisa quickly shut the door, sliding the deadbolt into place before collapsing against the wood. She slid slowly to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She didn't sob out loud, but David could see the violent tremors shaking her narrow shoulders. She had traded her shelter for his survival. She was completely broken, terrified, and utterly alone. Yet she had not regretted her choice. David lowered his head, a silent promise solidifying in his heart. Chapter 4. By mid-morning, the sleet had transitioned into a heavy, relentless snowfall, blanketing the grimy city streets in a deceptive layer of pristine white. Elisa stood by the small kitchen counter, staring at the single stale slice of bread resting on a chipped ceramic plate. It was the only food left in the apartment. Carefully, she broke the bread in two, creating one piece significantly larger than the other. She walked over to David, crouching down and offering him the larger portion. "You need your strength," she said softly. "It's not meat, but it's something." David stared at the bread, then looked up into her hollowed, exhausted eyes. He felt a profound ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the silver poisoning. Gently, he nudged her hand with his wet nose, pushing the bread back toward her. He refused to open his jaws. "You have to eat," Elisa insisted, her brow furrowing in concern. David let out a soft huff, resting his chin on his paws and deliberately closing his eyes, feigning sleep. He would not take the last morsel of food from a starving woman. After a long moment of silence, he heard the soft, hesitant sound of her chewing. Once she finished, Elisa pulled her threadbare coat back on, wrapping a faded wool scarf tightly around her face. She looked down at him, her expression a mix of fear and resolve. "I have to go out," she whispered, stepping toward the door. "I have to find work or something to sell. Please stay hidden. Don't go near the window. If Haskins sees you, he really will call animal control." She slipped out the door, the deadbolt clicking firmly into place behind her. The apartment plunged into a heavy silence. David waited until the sound of her footsteps faded down the iron staircase. Then he forced himself to stand. His muscles screamed in protest, the newly formed scar tissue stretching painfully over his ribs. The silver was gone, but the residual weakness lingered. He took a deep breath, focusing his energy inward. It was time. He could not protect her as a crippled wolf. The shift was excruciating. Without a full-pack bond to draw strength from, pulling his bones and muscles back into a human framework felt like breaking glass inside his veins. He suppressed a groan, his claws retracting, his dark fur melting away to reveal scarred, pale skin. He collapsed onto his hands and knees, panting heavily, sweat beading on his forehead as a tall, powerfully built human man. He stood up shakily, his dark hair falling into his golden eyes. He needed clothing. He quietly opened the single closet in the room. It was painfully bare. He found a pair of worn gray sweatpants that looked like they belonged to an old boyfriend, pulling them on. They were a bit tight on his muscular frame, but they sufficed. Stepping into the living space, David took in the reality of Elisa's life. The sheer poverty was staggering. Yet, on a small wooden crate functioning as a nightstand, he noticed a neatly folded stack of papers beneath a heavy stone. His curiosity got the better of him. He stepped closer, sliding the papers out. The embossed seal of the Crescent Moon Pack sat at the top of the first page. It was an official decree of banishment. David scanned the polite, bureaucratic language, masking unspeakable cruelty. Failure to produce a strong lineage. An Omega displaying unacceptable weaknesses. Detrimental to the pack's elite standing. Beneath the banishment letter was a medical bill, stamped with the word overdue. The charge was for emergency trauma care, severed mate bond. David's jaw clenched, his knuckles turning white as he held the paper. Her own mate had rejected her simply because she was an Omega, deemed too weak to breed strong soldiers for the Crescent Moon. They had ripped the bond from her soul and thrown her onto the streets of human territory to die. It was a vile violation of Lycan law, a crime punishable by death in David's own kingdom. He set the papers down, his blood burning with a cold, terrifying fury. He walked to the window, carefully wiping away a patch of condensation to look down at the street. 2 stories below, the snow was falling heavily. He spotted Elisa immediately. She was standing outside a corner bakery, holding a snow shovel, speaking animatedly to a man in an apron who was violently shaking his head. The man waved her away, retreating inside and locking the glass door. Elisa dropped her head, her thin shoulders slumping in defeat. She turned to walk back toward the alleyway leading to their building. Suddenly, a sleek, black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tires sliding slightly on the slush. David's eyes narrowed. The vehicle was entirely out of place in this dilapidated neighborhood. 2 men stepped out of the vehicle. Even from this distance, David recognized the predatory, arrogant posture of enforcer wolves. They were massive, clad in expensive leather jackets, their eyes scanning the street before locking onto Elisa's retreating figure. David felt a primal growl vibrate in his human throat. He watched as one of the men casually blocked the entrance to the alley, trapping Elisa between the brick wall and the street. She stopped dead in her tracks, backing away slowly, her posture radiating absolute terror. The men were not here by coincidence. The Crescent Moon Pack had found their exiled Omega, and their aggressive body language suggested they had not come to bring her home. David didn't hesitate. He turned away from the window, his golden eyes flashing with lethal intent. He had to reach her. Now. The frigid metal of the fire escape bit into the soles of David's bare feet as he descended the 2 stories with terrifying, silent speed. The heavy snowfall provided a natural screen, muffling the sound of his movements and chilling his bare chest, though his Lycan blood ran hot with adrenaline and rising fury. He did not feel the winter cold. He only felt the violent, driving instinct to shield what was his. And in the complex, primal logic of an alpha, the woman who had traded her survival for his was now under his absolute protection. He hit the icy pavement of the alleyway without making a sound, landing in a crouch behind a row of overflowing industrial dumpsters. Through the narrow gap, he assessed the situation. Elisa was backed completely against the frosted brick wall, her thin coat offering no defense against the freezing wind or the 2 massive enforcers boxing her in. The men were practically vibrating with malicious energy, their eyes flashing with the telltale amber glow of wolves pushing close to the surface. "Look at you," the larger of the 2 sneered. He had a jagged scar crossing his chin and reeked of cheap cologne and bloodlust. Scavenging in human trash like a rat. "You really are a pathetic sight, Elisa." "I signed the papers, Vance," Elisa said, her voice trembling violently, though she kept her chin raised. "I left the territory. I relinquished all pack rights. I have nothing left for Julian to take. Just let me walk away." "That's where you're wrong," the second enforcer chuckled, stepping closer and deliberately invading her personal space. Alpha Julian doesn't like loose ends. It makes him look weak, knowing his former mate is out here begging for scraps. He wants a clean slate with his new Luna. And you, little Omega, are a stain on that slate. Elisa's breath hitched in a sharp gasp of pure terror. She pressed her hands flat against the brick, her eyes darting frantically for an escape route, but the alley was effectively sealed. "He wouldn't," she whispered. "It's against Lycan law to execute a banished wolf without cause. The King's Guard would find out." Vance threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the alley walls. "The King. The King is missing, presumed dead in the northern woods. There's no law out here but Julian's, and his orders were very clear." Vance reached into his heavy leather jacket, his fingers closing around the hilt of a silver-plated hunting knife. David did not wait another second. He moved from behind the dumpster, not as a man, but as a force of nature. He crossed the distance in a blur of motion. The second enforcer barely had time to turn his head before David's hand clamped around his throat. With a single, brutal twist of his hips and a surge of raw, terrifying strength, David lifted the 200-pound wolf off his feet and hurled him into the brick wall. The man struck the masonry with a sickening crack, crumpling to the snow-covered pavement, completely unconscious. Vance spun around, his knife flashing in the gray light, his eyes widening in shock at the sudden appearance of a half-naked, powerfully built stranger in the freezing alley. "Who the hell are you?" Vance snarled, dropping into a defensive stance, his fangs lengthening as he prepared to shift. David did not answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply allowed the heavy, oppressive iron gates of his control to drop. He unleashed his aura, not the suppressed presence of a rogue, but the crushing, suffocating dominance of an Alpha King. The air in the alley instantly grew heavy, thick, and suffocating. The falling snowflakes seemed to freeze in midair. Vance's amber eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as the invisible weight of David's presence slammed into him. It was a biological override. Vance's inner wolf whimpered, entirely paralyzed by the staggering gap in their power. "Drop the knife," David commanded. His voice was not loud, but it resonated with a deep, unnatural timbre that vibrated in the marrow of their bones. Vance's hand shook violently. His fingers uncurled against his will, and the silver blade clattered uselessly onto the icy slush. He dropped to his knees, clutching his chest as he struggled to draw breath under the crushing pressure of David's dominance. "If Julian wants a clean slate," David said softly, stepping over the blade and looking down at the trembling enforcer, "tell him he has just declared war on a ghost. And this ghost is coming for his throat. If I ever see your face, or the face of any crescent moon wolf within 10 miles of this woman again, I will not leave you breathing. Do you understand?" Yes," Vance choked out, his forehead nearly touching the slush in an involuntary display of absolute submission. "Take your garbage and run," David growled, reining his aura back in as just enough to let the man move. Vance scrambled backward, hauling his unconscious partner up by the collar of his jacket, and dragged him frantically toward the idling SUV. The vehicle's tires squealed against the pavement as it sped away, leaving the alley in a stunned, ringing silence. David stood still for a moment, letting the cold air cool his racing blood. Then he turned slowly to face Elisa. She was still pinned against the wall, her eyes wide, staring at him with a mixture of profound shock and newfound terror. She was looking at his eyes, those striking, luminous, golden eyes. "It's you," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper in the wind. Elisa's knees finally gave out. The adrenaline that had kept her standing evaporated, leaving her hollow and trembling violently in the snow. Before she could hit the ground, David closed the distance, catching her gently by the elbows. His hands were incredibly warm, radiating a steady, comforting heat that felt entirely out of place in the freezing alley. "I've got you," he said, his voice stripped of the terrifying command he had used on the enforcers, returning to a smooth, quiet rumble. He quickly stripped off the heavy wool sweater he had found in her closet earlier, draping it over her shivering shoulders, uncaring that the freezing wind was now biting directly at his bare skin. He wrapped his arm securely around her waist, supporting almost all her weight, just as she had done for him the night before. "We need to get inside," he murmured, guiding her toward the rusted iron staircase. The climb was slow. Elisa's mind was spinning, unable to process the impossible reality walking beside her. The giant, dying black wolf who had bled on her rag rug was gone. In his place was a man who radiated a terrifying, awe-inspiring power, yet who held her with the utmost gentleness. When they reached the apartment, David guided her to the small, threadbare armchair in the corner. He immediately went to the radiator, examining the valve before finding a heavy wool blanket in the closet and wrapping it tightly around her. Elisa clutched the blanket to her chest, her teeth chattering. She watched him move around her tiny space, his large frame making the studio feel even more cramped. He moved with a regal grace, entirely unbothered by his lack of clothing or the freezing temperature. "You're a lichen," she finally managed to say, her voice cracking in the quiet room. David stopped by the window, checking the street below before turning to face her. "I am, but—" "You didn't just shift," she stammered, pulling the blanket tighter. "Your aura. It forced an enforcer to his knees without you even touching him. Only an alpha can do that. A very old, very strong alpha. My name is David," he said simply, choosing his words with absolute care. He wasn't ready to reveal his crown. The political ramifications would terrify her further, and right now, she just needed to feel safe. "And you saved my life last night, Elisa. I owe you a debt I can never fully repay." Elisa looked down at her bruised, trembling hands. The mention of her name on his lips felt strange, heavy with a respect she hadn't heard in years. "You read my papers." It wasn't a question. She saw the way the heavy stone had been moved on her makeshift nightstand. A deep, humiliating flush crept up her neck, warming her frozen cheeks. "You know what I am. You know I'm a banished Omega. An exile. Weak." David crossed the room in 2 long strides, kneeling on the faded rug directly in front of her. He was close enough that she could feel the heat rolling off his skin, close enough to see the faint, silvery scars crisscrossing his chest. "I know that your previous alpha is a fool and a coward," David said, his golden eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering intensity. "I know that a weak woman would have let a stranger die in a cage. A weak woman would not have dug silver buckshot out of a predator's flesh with a pair of tweezers and no painkillers. You are many things, Elisa, but you are not weak." Elisa stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. It was the first time in her life anyone had spoken to her with such validation. Her entire existence in the Crescent Moon Pack had been defined by submission, by keeping her head down and accepting whatever scraps of dignity Julian allowed her. "Why did they attack you?" she asked softly, desperate to change the subject before she broke down completely. "Silver buckshot. That's pack warfare." David's jaw tightened, a shadow passing over his features. "I was betrayed by someone I trusted. An ambush in the northern woods. They thought the silver had finished me. If it wasn't for you buying me from that smuggler, they would have been right. He stood up, his expression hardening into one of tactical resolve. But that is a problem for another day. Right now, our problem is Julian. Those enforcers will report back. They will tell him I am here, and they will bring a heavily armed strike team next time. We cannot stay in this apartment. Panic flared in Elisa's chest. Leave? But where would I go? I don't have any money. I don't have a car. I can't survive out there. You aren't surviving here, Elisa. David pointed out gently, gesturing to the empty kitchen and the freezing radiator. He reached into the pocket of the sweatpants, pulling out a thick roll of cash he had quietly confiscated from Vance's jacket in the alley. He tossed it onto the kitchen counter. We have funds, and you have me. He extended his hand toward her, his palm broad and calloused. Gather whatever means something to you. Leave the rest. We are leaving the city. Elisa looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his resolute, golden eyes. She had been cast out, hunted, and starved. She had every reason to distrust a powerful alpha. But as she looked at David, she realized she had nothing left to lose. And perhaps, for the first time in her life, something to gain. Slowly, her trembling fingers reached out and placed her hand in his. Packing took less than 3 minutes. Elisa's entire life, post-banishment, fit into a single frayed canvas duffel bag. She packed 2 spare sweaters, a pair of thick woolen socks that were unraveling at the heels, and a small cracked compass her father had given her before the pack wars had claimed his life. She didn't own photographs. The crescent moon pack forbade Omegas from keeping physical attachments to the past. The compass was her only anchor to a time before she was deemed a failure. David stood by the door, entirely dressed now in a heavy canvas winter coat and dark denim jeans he had purchased off a neighbor down the hall with Vance's confiscated roll of cash. The garments were slightly worn, but on his imposing frame, they looked entirely intentional, broad across the shoulders and functional. He watched her gently trace the glass of the compass before slipping it into the bag. He noted the profound reverence she held for the broken object, filing the observation away in his mind. Ready? He asked, his voice a low, steady anchor in the chaotic storm of her thoughts. Elisa zipped the bag, giving the freezing, dilapidated studio one last glance. Yes. They moved swiftly. The city streets were treacherous, heavily blanketed in a rapidly accumulating layer of snow that muffled the typical urban roar. Instead of heading toward the bus station, David guided her down 3 winding, unfamiliar blocks until they reached a small, fenced-in used car lot attached to a greasy mechanic's garage. The owner, a gruff older man smoking a cigar under a corrugated metal awning, sized them up with suspicious, narrowed eyes. David didn't waste time on pleasantries. He bypassed the newer sedans and walked directly to a boxy, dark green mid-90s Jeep Cherokee parked near the back fence. It had rusted wheel wells and a dented bumper. But David crouched, listening to the steady, unbothered rhythm of the engine block as it idled to keep the battery alive. He approached the owner, pulling a thick stack of bills from his pocket. He did not unleash his aura. This was a human, and Lycan law strictly forbade the coercion of humanity. But he utilized a natural, unyielding authority. 3,000. Cash. Right now, David stated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation or haggling. And we keep the plates. The mechanic looked at the money, then at David's cold, golden eyes, and simply tossed the keys. Within 10 minutes, they were navigating the icy off-ramps of the interstate, putting miles between themselves and the decaying apartment. The Jeep's heater roared to life, blasting a dry, metallic warmth into the cab. Elisa sat in the passenger seat, her hands tucked between her knees, watching the city skyline fade into a hazy gray smear in the side mirror. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken questions. Elisa watched David drive. He drove with the same effortless, commanding grace he displayed in the alley. His large, calloused hands gripped the steering wheel lightly, his eyes scanning the road and the rearview mirror with tactical precision. "They won't stop looking, you know," Elisa said quietly, the rhythmic thud of the tires over packed snow pulling the words from her throat. "Julian is fiercely proud. Vance surviving that alley means Julian's pride is bruised. He will send trackers." "Let him send them," David replied, his gaze not wavering from the road. The casual dismissal in his tone sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. "You don't understand," she pressed, turning her body slightly toward him. "The Crescent Moon is the largest pack in the tri-state area. They have resources, drones, hounds, corrupt local police on their payroll. I survived in the city because I was beneath his notice, a beggar he could comfortably ignore. But you humiliated his men. You threatened him." David finally glanced at her. The golden glow in his eyes was muted in the dim light of the cab, appearing as a warm, rich amber. "And I meant every word. You are safe with me, Elisa." "Why?" The question cracked in the quiet cab, brittle and raw. "Why are you doing this? You paid your debt. You could have left me in the alley and vanished into the woods. I am a banished Omega. I offer you no tactical advantage, no territory, no wealth. I am a liability to a rogue wolf." David's grip on the steering wheel tightened just a fraction. He looked back at the desolate highway, the falling snow creating a hypnotic tunnel of white light in the high beams. "A society is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable, Elisa," he said, his voice dropping to a smooth, rumbling register. "Julian judged you by a standard of brute violence. I judge you by the fact that you starved yourself to pull silver from a dying stranger's flesh. You are not a liability. You are the bravest person I have met in a very long time." Elisa fell completely silent. The words settled over her, dismantling years of cruel, systematic conditioning. She turned her face toward the frosted window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass to hide the fresh tears welling in her eyes. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to close her eyes without the suffocating fear of the morning. They drove for 4 straight hours, leaving the flat gray expanse of the city far behind as the terrain began to rise, twisting into the dense, ancient pine forests of the northern mountain range. The snow here was untouched, a pristine, blinding white that coated the towering evergreens in thick, heavy layers. David navigated the winding, unplowed logging roads with an ease that suggested he knew the territory intimately. Eventually, the Jeep's tires crunched to a halt in front of a heavily rusted iron gate. Beyond it, hidden beneath a canopy of snow-laden branches, sat a sturdy, single-story cabin made of dark, weathered timber. "A safe house," David explained, shifting the Jeep into park and cutting the engine. The sudden silence of the forest was absolute, ringing in Elisa's ears. "It belongs to a network. It hasn't been used in years, but it's secure. And more importantly, it sits on neutral ground. Julian's jurisdiction ends 50 miles south of here." Elisa grabbed her duffel bag, stepping out into the knee-deep snow. The air was brutally crisp, smelling of pure pine and frozen earth, entirely devoid of the exhaust and rot of the city. It was the scent of the wild, and her inner wolf, subdued and battered for years, gave a faint, phantom stir of recognition. David unlatched the heavy padlock on the cabin door with a sharp, practiced twist of a hidden wire Inside, the air was stale and freezing, smelling of dust and old wood ash. The space was purely functional, a heavy cast-iron wood stove in the center, a small kitchenette, and 2 cots pushed against the far wall. "Stay by the door," David murmured. He moved swiftly, his survival instincts taking over. Within minutes, he had cleared the flue, gathered dry kindling from a sealed metal bin, and coaxed a roaring fire to life inside the cast-iron stove. The orange light danced across the log walls, instantly transforming the desolate cabin into a beacon of warmth. He pulled one of the cots closer to the stove, dragging a heavy, dust-covered wool blanket from a cedar chest and shaking it out. "Sit," he instructed gently. Elisa obeyed, dropping her bag and sinking onto the edge of the cot. She held her numb hands out toward the radiating heat, sighing as the painful stiffness in her joints began to melt away. David moved to the kitchenette, pulling a few cans of preserved soup and a battered tin pot from the cupboards. As he worked, Elisa watched the broad line of his back. "You said you were betrayed," she began softly, the crackle of the fire giving her courage. "By someone you trusted." In these woods, David paused, a can of soup resting in his palm. The firelight caught the tense, rigid line of his jaw. He turned slowly, leaning against the dusty counter. "My beta," David said, the title tasting like ash on his tongue. He chose his words with absolute precision, maintaining his cover while offering her his truth. "We grew up together, fought side by side in the territorial disputes. I thought of him as a brother. But power is a sickness for some. He wanted leadership. He knew he couldn't defeat me in a fair challenge, so he hired mercenaries to ambush me during a border patrol. They used Silver. They thought I bled out in the ravine." Elisa's eyes widened in horror. "A beta turning on his leader? That's treason. The King's Guard would execute him." "If they knew," David agreed softly. "But he likely returned to the territory declaring me dead by rogue hands, claiming leadership as a grieving hero. I am so sorry," she whispered. She understood the sting of rejection. But the betrayal of a lifelong brother was a different, sharper kind of agony. "My alpha, Julian. He didn't just reject me. He called the entire pack to the courtyard. He forced me to my knees in the snow, stripped me of my pack scent, and told the pups to throw stones to drive me out. He wanted them to learn that weakness was a disease." A low, vibrating growl filled the cabin, so deep it rattled the tin pot on the counter. David's eyes flashed a brilliant, unrestrained gold. The raw fury in his expression was terrifying. Yet, miraculously, Elisa did not feel an ounce of fear. The anger was not directed at her. It was entirely on her behalf. "A true leader does not humiliate his people to prove his strength," David said, his voice dropping into a lethal, silken whisper. "Julian is a coward masquerading as a wolf." He walked over to the stove, crouching in front of her. He reached out, his warm, calloused fingers gently wrapping around her frozen hands. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity up her arms. His thumb softly brushed over her bruised knuckles. "You are safe here, Elisa," he promised, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Suddenly, the wind howling outside the cabin died down. The absolute silence of the mountain returned. But then, cutting through the stillness, came a sound that made Elisa's blood run entirely cold. A howl. It was distant, echoing off the jagged peaks. But it was not the lonely cry of a rogue. It was a synchronized, multi-toned call. A hunting pack. David's head snapped toward the frost-covered window, his fingers tightening protectively around hers. The warmth of the moment shattered, replaced instantly by the icy grip of impending violence. Elisa spent her last coins to save a terrified, bleeding wolf, fully expecting it to be her final act in a world that had mercilessly discarded her. Instead, she purchased her own salvation, inadvertently rescuing the Alpha King and proving that true strength lies not in dominance, but in unwavering compassion. Through a desperate act of kindness in a freezing alley, a broken Omega found her undeniable worth, and a betrayed king found his queen, forever altering the destiny of their kind. If you enjoyed this dramatic tale of resilience, redemption, and unexpected royalty, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment below letting us know your favorite twist, and stay tuned for more cinematic stories of love and survival.